Think about that. Think about what they're asking for. The reason why we're still beefing with Cuba is that, what was it, in the 50s or the 60s, they kicked out our companies and went communist? And we're still mad at them? Like, what are we? Are we like a fighting fucking married couple or something like that? What are we, some fucking snarky, like, housewives of New Jersey or some shit? Yeah, well, you didn't accept my companies and you don't agree with my political ideology, so, Like, what is this? Is this really the conversation that we're having on a national level or an international level with politics? And remember, the arguments themselves collapse under their own weight, because if one of the main arguments is, they're communists, we can't do business with them. We do how much trade with China? China is a gargantuan communist country. And we pretend like, it's also because of the human rights violations in Cuba. That's why we can't, do anything with them, and we should have the embargo. But let me read you a list of some of our allies, okay? Saudi Arabia, the theocratic kingdom, okay? Women aren't allowed to drive. Women aren't allowed to vote. You can still get stoned to death if you're gay. We do business with them all the time. All right? One of the most repressive countries on earth. We're still like, no, that's our boy. What are you talking about? We love that place. Equatorial Guinea. All right, this is a dictatorship, and they brutally repress their society. The only reason why we're buddy-buddy with them is oil. Myanmar, Vietnam, Tajikistan, the list goes on. Turkey. These are all countries that have incredibly dubious human rights records violations. I mean, we do too, right? But the idea that we use that as one of the pillars of the arguments against doing business with Cuba or opening up, the borders with Cuba and allowing trade and allowing, travel and all that stuff. It's just such a stupid argument.
Cuba, Cuba, you very nice place, from hills of Guantanamo to southern Havana. Cuba, friend of all except America, a very nosy people with bone up their ass. Cuba, in the Western world,
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report.
Thank you, Amy. We love you, Amy. You're the best. Alrighty. Let's move on to some Cuba news, because I've been getting into some debates with my family about Cuba and shit. And so I've been touching up on fucking Cuban history, bro. And I'm right. I am right. America is just starving Cuba, hoping that they fucking overthrow the government, and it's not working, and they're not overthrowing the government, and then they're starving and shit and poor, and then everyone's looking at them like, oh, why is the Cuban government just allowing their people to be poor and starving? Oh, even though we have all these policies that don't let them trade with the world and shit. Get the fuck out of here, everyone that disagrees with me. Fuck out of here.
Disintegrating buildings of Cuba's once magnificent capital. A reflection of a crumbling economy in what was once regarded as the jewel of the Caribbean. It's as though the country had been frozen in time, back to 1962, to when the United States declared an economic, financial, and diplomatic embargo against its tiny communist neighbor.
I got into an argument with my debate with my dad about Cuba being in fucking embargo and sanctions, and you know what he says? He's like, no, it's not an embargo and sanction. That's not happening. That's not real. No. I'm like, yes, it is. And he's like, no, if you're gonna do news and politics, you gotta actually be educated. And then I look it up, and it's real, it's true. And then I look up all the policies, and then I have motherfuckers text me saying that I'm wrong and that it's the Cuban government when it's America blockading, starving the people of Cuba. And then when they're poor and shit and dying, and they protest every day, and the government cracks down, which is bad. See, I criticize both sides. I'm not one-sided, one-handed and shit on my criticism. America needs to stop the blockade. And if they fucking collapse and revolt, then let them do it. But don't starve them to death. And then when people look at them and see they're starving, say, oh, it's Cuba's fault. No, it's fucking America's fault. What the fuck are you talking about? What's going on here? Jesus Christ. And then you find out that in the United Nations votes, America, Israel, and I'm going to leave Ukraine out of it because I support Ukraine, but they abstained from the vote. But the U.S. and Israel keep voting down to lift the blockade on fucking Cuba. So what is that? Is that Cuba's fault? No, it's America's fault. It's America and their allies. What the fuck you mean it's Cuba's fault? What is this shit? Just blaming Cuba for everything? Are you serious? Oh, they broke free from slavery. It's Cuba's fault. They broke free from slavery. Oh, that's bad. We don't like that. They broke free from slavery. It's Cuba's fault. Why they break free from slavery? Haiti breaks free from slavery. Oh, it's Haiti's fault. Hey, look, they're all poor. It's Haiti's fault. They broke free from slavery. If they're poor now, it's their fault. They should have kept slavery around. No, get the fuck out of here. What are these arguments, dude? This shit pisses me off.
It was at the height of the Cold War. 75-year-old Rolando Ignacio Ruiz was 15 then, just 3 years after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. 60 years later, he laments that the embargo is still in place.
That would be like if China is starving Taiwan through policies that they put in place, and then you're like, oh, well, Taiwan is the government of Taiwan's fault. They can't feed their people. They're poor as fuck. It's their fault. You don't look at anything else happening. You don't look at what China's doing. You don't look at what their big nation nearby is doing with their trade. You just look at fucking Taiwan. Say, oh, it's their fault. They're poor as shit. They're starving. It's their fault. And they can't ever improve, so kill them. Topple their government. Fucking destroy them. Kill Cuba. Take everything. Take the land. Build fucking luxury condos on it. Build some supermarkets. Let's make it America, huh? Because they're wacky people and they can't get their shit together because America is starving them. But it's their fault, though. No, dude, that's fucking stupid.
They should have removed it long time ago. If after all this time the United States hasn't achieved anything, it certainly won't now. It only hurts our people, but the government remains in place.
He's not wrong. The world's longest economic embargo has certainly hurt ordinary Cubans, limiting access to medicine, cheap U.S. imports, technology, and credit through a U.S. dollar-dominated financial system.
Oh, but that's Cuba's fault. That's Cuba's fault. Oh, Cuba should have never tried to rebel against their dictator. And then they implemented another dictator. But now they're kind of like a weird little authoritarian democracy. But they should have never tried to overthrow their dictator and free from slavery and shit. Why'd they do that? Why'd they do that? They should have let the Spaniards fuck them all day and rule their land. They should have let Batista stay there and rule their land and run the casinos. And no, dude. That's not how countries work.
Its purpose has always...
People rebel and overthrow governments because the governments were shitty. If you're starving Cuba and they're not overthrowing the government, I'm looking at this government, I'm like, goddamn, maybe if they're holding down a fucking sanctions and all this shit and still surviving, they're doing something right. I don't know what it is. I don't know, maybe they're too authoritarian, they're cracking down, but like, goddamn. If our fucking starvation thing ain't working and they're still in power, like what the fuck are we doing?
To modify or
what are we doing?
Cuba's
just give up. Stop trying to starve them. Be nice. Trade with them.
On the contrary, in Cuba's case, the embargo has become a fundamental component for the survival of the Cuban state and its current government. The tougher the sanctions, the easier it is to accuse the United States of violating sovereignty, destabilizing the country, and organizing rebellion.
That is exactly what happened when economic hardships and restrictions on freedom of expression exploded into unprecedented mass demonstrations last year. Referring to 60 years of economic embargo, President Miguel Díaz-Canel alluded to sanctions against Cuba's allies, Venezuela and Nicaragua.
This criminal and immoral policy imposed systematically against us is a massive violation of the human rights of the Cuban people. And it is the same one that is now threatening and attacking other nations of our region with unilateral...
America doesn't give a fuck about human rights, and we can see that clearly from fucking Israel and Gaza. America doesn't give a fuck about human rights, and we can see that clearly from Haiti and in the U.S., how we treat them and shit. We don't give a fuck about human rights. We don't give a fuck. Come to learn that recently. That no fucking country gives about human rights. Every country uses it as a fucking cudgel, and they toss it around, and whoever lands on, whoever it looks nicer on, they use it. And I would love America to be better with human rights and actually give a shit about it. And that's why I care so much. This is why I care so much. Because we are acting really fucking evil right now. Imagine if China was doing this to Taiwan. Oh, because China doesn't like Taiwan. They want to take over that land, but it's a different government. Oh, why don't we just go in there and topple them, take over? Oh, we're putting a little fucking military base called Taiwanamo Bay. We'll call it Taiwanamo Bay. China could do that, right? Like the U.S. did with Guantanamo Bay? Go in there and take shit over? Oh, no. If China does it, that's bad. That's bad. Which it is bad. But the U.S. does the same shit, which is what I'm trying to say. Like, the U.S. needs to be better, dude. Be better. Try to work with these little countries. Try to be friendlier with them. Try to change them, like, with policies. Don't be like a fucking asshole and, like, just cut them off and let them starve to death and hope that they overthrow their fucking president. That's not gonna work. It should have worked a long time ago if it's going to work.
And milder ones against Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega have in fact encouraged alliances with China, Russia, and Iran, making them less dependent on the U.S.
I don't know of any case in Latin America where sanctions have produced the desired results, even partially.
The same might be said for unilateral sanctions in other parts of the world. But while they may not be effective, they remain Washington's preferred means of persuasion.
Yeah, that's all we know how to do. All we know what to do, sanctions, embargoes. Because we're such a fucking shitty capitalist country. It's all about money and resource and capitalism. So we'll cut you off from that, and then you're fucked, and you're starving, your people are starving. And then we point the finger at you and say it's your fault. Even though it's clearly America's fault. Like, we're pulling the embargo, we're pulling the policies, we're bullying other governments to not trade with Cuba. You know what I mean? We're fucking them over in the United Nations votes and shit. Like, come on.
America is opening up relations with Cuba, and it's a big deal, ending decades of hostility and beginning a new era between the two countries. But to understand just how big of a deal, where that hostility really came from, why it took so long to end, you've got to go back, way back. Not to the 1950s, as many Americans might think, but to the 1850s. The story starts with America divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery politics, and one of their many fights is over the Spanish colony of Cuba. Pro-slavery lawmakers want to buy Cuba from Spain, or take it by force to turn it into a new slave state. Anti-slavery politicians oppose this, calling it imperialism.
Yes, that's imperialism.
But fast forward to 1898, after slavery's over. Americans have a different version of this same argument when Cubans rise up against Spain. The U.S. joins them, starting the Spanish-American War. But Americans divide.
So the U.S. joins Cuba, the Cubans, to help them fight off the Spaniards. But then once they fight off the Spaniards, America tries to go in and take over and shit. Like, oh no, you guys are mine. Never mind.
The U.S. seize Cuba from Spain
Fuck this
for
freedom
itself,
shit.
or liberate the island.
I want this.
This is part of a much bigger debate at the time over whether the U.S. should explicitly become a European-style imperial power. So this is an argument about Cuba, but it's also an argument about America, what kind of country it should be. Should America be the kind of country that controls Cuba?
No.
Or that respects it
Yes,
as
respect,
a fellow sovereign nation?
respect.
And that argument has continued in different forms ever since. At this point, in 1898, the fight happens in Congress. Each side passes laws trying to force their way, and it ends up with a weird split baby policy, with Cuba winning independence, but other quasi-imperial American rule. The U.S. would take over Guantanamo Bay, dictate Cuba's foreign policy, and give itself the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Then came the American interventions in Cuba in 1906, 1917. Each time, the U.S. military takes over for a few years, ostensibly to resolve some political crisis, but that usually means protecting American interests, such as sugar import.
Oh? What? We're protecting sugar? America just protecting the sugar? No, America can't just be protecting the sugar and the capitalist assets of Cuba. That isn't the reason why they're just there, is it?
Today, when Americans think about the U.S. and Cuba, we think of the Cold War, but Cubans often think back to this imperial era.
Badass Americans, yo.
And that era technically ends
Badass
in
Americans want that
1933,
Cuban sugar.
an uprising against Cuba's government. Under US law, America is supposed to intervene again, but President Franklin Roosevelt wants to end the imperial era, so he declares neutrality.
Yay, that's
Over
good.
the next
That's
20
good.
years, Cuba becomes a democracy, and one that's generally friendly with the US. That changes in 1952, when a former president and military leader named Fulgencio Batista seizes power.
This dude was fucking evil. This dude was evil, guy. This was a bad guy. Bad hombre. This motherfucker killed between hundreds and 20,000 Cubans were killed under the Batista regime.
Cuba, friend of all except America. They're very nosy people with gold up their ass. Cuba, industry best. We invented coffee and the shaving knife.
It's really hard to read this shitty ass fucking paper.
From hills of Guantanamo to southern Havana. From brass mighty penis of a leader.
Okay, so Castro killed like 2,500 anti-Castro demonstrators or whatever, or people, you know what I mean, that you didn't like. That's bad. 2,500 is bad, right? But 20,000 is fucking worse, dude. Terrible, dude. And I debated my dad. I was like, oh, so if Castro was bad, because I'm like, okay, Castro's bad. He did some bad things. He didn't like the gays and shit. That's bad. He did a lot of things that were bad. But compared to Batista, he was like better. Like literally, I'm sorry. Lesser of two evilism. I'm using it right now. The same way we're using it in our democracy versus Trump and Biden. I'm going to use this shit right now. The lesser of two evils. That was Castro, the lesser of two evils. This motherfucker killed 20,000. Castro killed 2,500. And a lot of those were not during the war, which is what I read there. So that's bad. Killing people's bad for no reason, especially. Even in war, but
Cuba's communist uprising and Fulgencio Batista seizes power in a coup, suspends the constitution, and imposes.
So this motherfucker takes over power, suspends the constitution, dude. Imagine if someone suspended the American Constitution. You would go ape shit. You would fucking tear shit up. You would go up in there, fuck this dude. Not literally like sexually fucking, but like you would, you know, screw him over. You would be like, man, fuck out of here. Punch him in the face.
Increasingly oppressive rule. Cuba's communist uprising begins the next year, led by a young Fidel Castro.
Hey, get him, boy.
American politics at this
Look at
point
that beret.
is obsessed with fears of communism. So the U.S. backs Batista in the war, no matter how brutal he becomes.
So because we're scared of communism and socialism and any right-wing ideology because it's against capitalism, remember, the more left-wing you go, the more anti-capitalist you go. That's just how it works. And for some reason, the more right-wing you go, the more pro-capitalist you become. I don't know why. That's just how it is. And also, let me throw this in there, the Nazis back in Germany loved capitalism. Wink, wink. That's all I'm saying. They were cool with capitalism. If you were a business owner that was Jewish, no. If you were a business owner that was Aryan and white, yes. If you were a business owner that was socialist or communist or whatever, no. You were a union worker, a union leader, a unionist, no. Dead. They killed you. If you were a fucking cripple, dead. They killed you. That's all I'm saying. So it seems like to me, the left is way better than the right. I'm just saying. I don't know. I'm just saying the left is way better than the right. Castro's way better than Batista. Write that shit on my gravestone.
For Americans, this feels like a front in the struggle against communism. But for Cubans, it feels like Batista is an extension of American imperialism.
Yes, literally, he was.
A continuation of their long fight for freedom. And the communists win in 1959 and Castro takes power. The US, fearing communism's expansion, sets up the embargo to strangle Cuba's economy, tries to assassinate Castro,
embargo!
And even in the disaster known as Bay of Pigs,
embargo!
sends in CIA-trained Cubans to try to take over the island. Castro turns to the Soviets for help, and in 1962 they nearly start World War III when the US blocks Soviet efforts to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. The incident scares everyone enough that things settle into a tense.
Now look, he didn't mention this. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, yes, the Soviet Union did send missiles to Cuba, but this all started because America put missiles in Turkey, sealing the deal with Italy and Turkey 60 years ago during April 1963. The U.S. Air Force took steps to implement the final stage of the secret U.S.-Soviet deal that helped resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis, with dismantling of the Jupiter missiles deployed in Italy and Turkey. So America deployed these missiles in Italy and Turkey, and the Soviet Union's response to that was to send missiles to Cuba. It wasn't just that the Soviet Union, evil, they're evil, and they just put missiles in Cuba, and they were about to blow the world up. No. This was a response to something America did with their missiles. All right? So it's like, it's bad on both sides. It's not like just, communist bad, communism, the government. Like, I'm surrounded by so many of these fucking Red Scare, fear-mongered people, man. Jesus Christ.
Put nuclear missiles in Cuba. The incident scares everyone enough that things settle into a tense but basically peaceful status quo. Over time, ordinary Cubans are squeezed between the US embargo and Castro's dictatorship. In 1980, Castro tries to relieve some political dissent by briefly allowing Cubans to leave the island, and 125,000 arrived in Florida.
And you know what's funny? After this happened, like, when this happened, this shit pissed off. This pissed off the Republicans in America. Because the Republicans in America hate immigration, right? They hate people from other countries. They're fucking racist. And then they see all these Cubans that were released. They're like, Castro basically released all the Cubans that didn't like Cuba now. He was like, oh, you guys want to go back to America? All right, get the fuck out of here. Go. Chew. Bye-bye. If you want to leave, leave. If you want to stay here, stay here. And that did piss off. That did piss off
relieve some political dissent by briefly allowing Cubans to leave the island, and 125,000 arrive in Florida. No one realizes it at the time, but this adds a completely new dimension to the conflict. It's now also about the internal Cuban battle between...
Oh, and all these fucking people that fled to America? Some of them ended up being politicians, and I bet some of them are pushing for policies that fuck over Cuba now because they're in America.
Castro versus Cuban dissidents, which plays out through American politics.
Yup.
And this becomes really important in the 1990s. After the Soviet Union collapses, President Bill Clinton, seeing Cuba poses no threat, wants to end the conflict. And so does Castro, who can't count on Soviet aid anymore. But Cubans in America, who suffered terribly at Castro's hand, want to see him fall and push for keeping the embargo. In the middle of this fight, in 1996, Cuba shoots down 2 private planes chartered by Cuban-American activists. There's a big backlash in the US, and Clinton backs down. 20 years later, President Barack Obama tries again to end the conflict. By now, Americans don't really support the embargo. Lots of Cuban Americans are now economic migrants rather than political exiles, so they want openness. Fidel is getting old, and in 2008 hands power to his brother Raul, who knows the country needs to change. The US and Cuba start secret talks in 2013. The new Pope, Francis, helps negotiate. In 2014, they reveal their agreement to end the conflict, and the next year, Obama becomes the first president to visit since Calvin Coolidge in 1928. The US and Cuba have never really had normal relations until now, and that's crucial to understanding why it took so long for this to happen. So much has passed between the two countries over the past century, and the US has at times treated Cuba as more of a colony than it's a real country.
Yep, we do treat them like a fucking colony, dude. And people need to understand that shit.
Finally be ready.
People need to understand that we're treating Cuba like a colony. We treat Puerto Rico like a colony. We treat Dominican Republic like a colony. We treat Haiti like a colony. We are still acting like a fucking colonial empire sometimes. And people need to educate themselves and understand that shit. It's not just me getting mad and being like wacky and weird in my politics. No. I know why I fucking feel the way I feel, dude. We're fucking over these countries. We are. You know what I mean? And I'm seeing it happen right before my eyes with Gaza. With Israel and Gaza, dude. I'm seeing that shit happen right before my eyes. We're literally supporting a fucking ethnic cleansing at the least. At the least.
Cuban soul, artist heart, blowing clouds of light. The fire in our hearts, burning through the night. No longer shall we stand as the planet's demise. United we'll rise, with hope in our eyes. With hope in our eyes. Revolution in the air, it's time to take a stand. For the future of our world, we'll fight hand in hand. Through the darkness and despair, a new dawn will arise. With our hearts on fire, we'll paint the sky.